So we're creating Path of Exile 2 as a new campaign alongside Path of Exile 1 with a shared endgame. The original campaign is still fully playable, and because it's the same game, it'll still continue to be maintained with all of the updates and game system improvements that we'll make to Path of Exile.
That was from the first ExileCon in 2019, where Chris from Grinding Gear Games announced that PoE 2 would simply be a campaign extension on top of PoE 1. And this is from yesterday.
So, as Jonathan explained, Path of Exile 1 will continue to be its own unique game once Path of Exile 2 comes out. We will continue to update it with expansions and leagues going forward.
Just before we continue, I want to make this very clear. I'm only going to comment on this one aspect of what we saw. I'm not really going to comment on PoE 2 more broadly, other than the fact that I think the game will be totally fine, and it's not quite as slow as people think. When it finally releases, it'll be an absolute banger, I'm certain of that. Now to this idea though of two games with one name. While there are clearly a ton of shared concepts between the two PoE games, from the gameplay showcases, it seems that PoE 2 hedges much more towards the vision of reactive gameplay and being able to counter what monsters throw out at you. This is in line with what has been articulated in patch notes historically meant to slow down players, things like Expedition, but it is also clear from this that they've concluded that the sort of gameplay style that is very reactive and counteractive is not quite compatible with the current iteration of PoE, where the fantasy really just is blasting. So they're splitting the game. Why is this a problem? Ironically, Chris kind of says it best.
For years now, we've been wanting to make a sequel to Path of Exile. The problem with that, though, is that sequels split a community between two products. It's also hard for a sequel to compete with the amount of content and features that the original game has. We've just spent 6 years making expansions for Path of Exile, so imagine if we released a Path of Exile 2 and it was just a bare campaign with none of that extra content.
But it's not just about community split. In an effort to mitigate the second downside, sinking the original value of the game, Grinding Gear Games has decided to keep both versions of the game, leading to the emergence of perhaps the most dangerous problem of all: splitting up the resources. We've already heard rumblings that at times there were less than 10 employees working on Path of Exile 1, while the rest of the staff were working on PoE 2 during early development. Now, I don't know how big of a company Grinding Gear Games actually is, but I do know that their employees are really strained, that their devs work really hard. I know this personally because when I was doing the unique design, I was always messaging Rishi, and he'd be up at really ungodly hours in New Zealand time, able to answer questions about unique item design, the philosophy behind what they were trying to do in future patches, and this was just a for-fun project basically. Frankly, we get more content than almost any other game probably does, but this definitely comes at a human resource cost. Now you duplicate this across two games, and it's inevitable, to me at least, that we end up with one of two things. One, really burnt out employees, or two, a half-assed product. And Ron Swanson gives us the best advice here.
Never half-ass two things. Whole-ass one thing.
Maybe my trepidation towards all this comes as sort of a reaction to what bigger game studios have done this year, especially in terms of releasing new versions of pre-existing games that I thought were pretty good. So pessimism granted, my prediction is this. Both games end up running simultaneously with a staggered schedule that Chris has already alluded to, but as a result, two major parasitic forces emerge. Firstly, PoE 1 starts to get much less new expansion content, and especially less new bosses. As a result, PoE 1 players start to feel much more neglected and start to feel resentment not only towards the staff, but also towards PoE 2 players. On the other side, people playing PoE 2 will constantly be comparing it to the base game, the original game, and this is inevitably pushed even further by the fact that they share the same namesake. Players will constantly be thinking about how their X was faster, more fun, smoother, and more excitable. And I'm honestly scared of this. I think point blank, PoE has the best game community that I've ever been a part of. Hell, even our biggest infighting, our biggest civil wars, our feather light conflicts about, which game mode, whether that's hardcore, solo self-found, ruthless, is slightly better than the other ones. And really, no one actually cares. Just people want to have fun. So when it comes to this, I don't really see a great way out of the dilemma. But to me, and perhaps only to me, the best timeline is where we actually commit to PoE 2 moving forward and prepare for its eventual arrival and overtaking in 2 years. Breaking up with something that you have isn't easy, especially if you love it a lot, but I'd much rather have the serial monogamy of PoE 1 that shifts over to a brand new PoE 2 than trying to juggle a polygamous asynchronous relationship. So if that's the case, what would I do with PoE for the next 2 years? Well, surely that much time gives me enough chance to beat Nick or Ben. Just one time, right?